welcome to the second slide of the day. So, this past week we read two books. We read The Introduction from Pastrix by Nadia Bolz-Weber, and we read the final chapter in All Creatures Great and Small by James Herriot. And we are going to go over the homework questions here. So, the first question was, what stage of cognitive development is Nadia demonstrating? How? So in the introduction of Pastrix by Nadia Bolz-Weber, she is demonstrating the post-formal stage of thinking, which is the stage of thinking after Piaget's stage ends. So it's after that final stage in Piaget. Psychologists theorize that there is in fact a fifth stage of thinking called post-formal thinking. And this is evidenced by her metacognition as she's thinking about other people and their opinions. So if we read from the book, the sky was so gorgeous that I rolled down all my windows and leaned forward to try to see more of it out of my windshield. A trucker next to me winked and eyed my tattooed arms, unaware, I'm certain, that the big tattoo covering my forearm was of St. Mary Magdalene, and that I was a Lutheran seminary student, soon to become a Lutheran pastor. Truckers, bikers, and ex-convicts smile at me a lot more than, say, investment bankers do. I smiled back, then returned my glance to the blue sky above, becoming lost in the thought of the outrageous out-there-ness of space. The beauty of our sky really is just a nice way for the earth to protect us from the terror of what's so vast and unknowable beyond. The boundlessness of the universe is disturbing when you think about it. It's too big and we're too small. Suddenly, in that moment, all I could think was, what the hell am I doing? Seminary? Seriously? With a universe this vast and unknowable, what are the odds that this story of Jesus is true? Come on, Nadia, it's a fucking fairy tale. And in that very next moment, I thought this. Except that throughout my life, I've experienced it to be true. I once heard someone say that my belief in Jesus makes them suspect that I intellectually suck my thumb at night. But I cannot pretend, as much as sometimes I would like to, that I have not throughout my life experienced the redeeming, destabilizing love of a surprising God. Even when my mind protests, I still can't deny my experiences. This thing is real to me. Sometimes I experience God when someone speaks truth to me. Sometimes in the moments when I admit I am wrong. Sometimes in the loving of someone unlovable. Sometimes in reconciliation that feels like it comes from somewhere outside of myself. But almost always I experience God. It comes in the form of some kind of death and resurrection. So we learned in this past week that there are three types of post-formal thinking. There's dualistic, there's relativistic, and there's reflective. Dualistic thinking is that there is a right and a wrong, and there's opinion, and so you have to have a right and a wrong. Whereas relativistic thinking is the idea that everybody has an opinion and everybody is entitled to that opinion, and you can then end up in the place where you're going, because everybody has an opinion and everybody's entitled to that opinion, then everybody is equally right and there's no such thing as a right answer because everybody's allowed to be right. Nadia is in the third stage, the reflective judgment stage, where of post-formal thinking, where she's saying, okay, there is probably a right and a wrong, but everybody is entitled to their own opinion, and I'm going to take into account these opinions as well as my own opinions, and I am going to assess these opinions based on criteria that I come up with. I'm going to assess these opinions, this data, this information, based on my own experiences and what I know to be true. And I'm going to reflect on this, and as such, I do believe that there's a God because my experiences have shown me that there is a God, and it's true that lots of people believe that there's a God, so it's not just me. I'm not just holding this, but I believe there's a God because I have reflected on the knowledge, on my knowledge, the knowledge of others, the evidence before me, and assessed this evidence based on specific criteria, and yes, there is a God. She recognizes that other people think differently by saying, oh yeah, my friend thinks I suck my thumb at night intellectually. But she's saying, and she even has thoughts, like she has doubts. She talks about having these doubts in God, but then she goes, no, I really do. I believe that there is this higher power. I believe that there is a God because I have experienced this. So she is showing post-formal thinking and reflective judgment in this passage. So the next question is, an important aspect of development in early adulthood is choosing a vocation. What vocation does Nadia choose? Consider Bronfenbrenner's theory. What are some external factors that may have influenced this decision? So as we just read, Nadia is studying to be a Lutheran pastor. So that is her vocation, is that of a Lutheran pastor. As to what influences it, we have a number of things in multiple levels of Bronfenbrenner's theory. So we'll start at the end of the introduction. How the Christian faith, while wildly misrepresented in so much of American culture, is really about death and resurrection. It's about how God continues to reach into the graves we dig for ourselves and pull us out, giving us new life, in ways both dramatic and small. This faith helped me get sober, and is helping me forgive the fundamentalism of my Church of Christ upbringing, and it helps me to not always have to be right. Smiley TV preachers might tell you that following Jesus is about being good so that God will bless you with cash and prizes, but really it's much more gruesome and meaningful. It's about spiritual physics. Something has to die for something new to live. So, we know that her microsystem growing up, that she was in the Church of Christ, and that she found this very oppressive, very repressive. So her microsystem influenced her to be specifically a Lutheran pastor because she was raised as a Christian. She was raised to believe in God, but she didn't like that fundamentalism and that lack of freedom, so she decided to pursue Lutheran rather than Christ of Church because there's a lot more freedom. It's a lot more forgiving. It's a lot more forgiving. It's a lot more open to differences and that kind of thing. So that is part of her microsystem. Her church and her parents, how she was raised in that microsystem, influenced her decision to become a Lutheran pastor. Then there's also the macro system. She's growing up she's in the United States, and the United States has a very Christian culture. So it's considered the norm. It's considered, you're just expected to be Christian. And if you're not, and you have to volunteer that information if you're not Christian, otherwise you will be assumed to be Christian. So this culture of Christianity likely also influenced her because she is more aware that there are other sects of Christianity, and so she could better choose one that fit her needs. And Lutheranism is one of the main forms of Christianity here in the United States. So both the microsystem and the macrosystem are working together. There was also probably an aspect of the exosystem because she talks about getting sober. It is quite possible, we don't know, but it's quite possible that she therefore participated in either Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, both of which have Christian founding. They had a Christian founding, and to this day they are very Christian organizations. You know, you start the meeting with a prayer, you're told that you need to have faith in a higher power to help you, to guide you through this, that kind of thing. Both AA and NA would be considered an exosystem because it is a set program. There's an entity which can influence you. And so going through this type of recovery program, this Christian-based recovery program, which most people don't know it's Christian, but it is, could very much impact her in terms of this message of believing in a higher power, having faith in that higher power, helping you to get through and to, understand and accept what you cannot control and to give that control up to a higher power. That's part of her exosystem, and that would very much impact her choice to become a thing. So there we have it. We have the microsystem, we have the exosystem, and we have the macrosystem all working together to influence her in her vocational choices of becoming a Lutheran pastor. So the final 3 questions are on All Creatures Great and Small by James Herriot. And the first question is, you read a chapter from James Herriot's All Creatures Great and Small. Would Erik Erikson consider James and Helen to be developmentally successful? Why or why not? So, in young adulthood, Erik Erikson proposed that young adults are going through the stage of intimacy versus isolation. And during this stage, you are exploring whether or not you can form these intimate connections and long-lasting connections with other people. Now, it's really important to understand that this intimacy, it doesn't mean sex. He's not talking about sex when he's talking about intimacy versus isolation. He's talking about commitment and emotional intimacy, that emotional trust, commitment, connection. That's what he's talking about when he's talking about intimacy versus isolation. Can you create this connection with another person and have it be a committed long-term thing? It doesn't have to be romantic in nature. This was something that a couple of you were asking about, you were a little confused about. You can pass intimacy and versus isolation without having a significant other and getting married or having a partner, that kind of thing. It's friends. Your best friend in the world. If you two have this intimate emotional connection and you know that that best friend is your person and you can absolutely trust that you can call them at 2 a.m. and they, no matter what, they will come and they will help you, and vice versa, you would help them no matter what. It's, a good friend will help you kill someone, but a best friend will get a shovel. So it's that trust. It's that knowing that this person is there for you no matter what. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about intimacy versus isolation. And they do pass it. A lot of you said that he passed it, that he and Helen, so James and Helen, passed intimacy versus isolation because they got married. And yes, that's important that they made this commitment. But that, I don't think, is the most telling piece of evidence in the reading for why they passed intimacy versus isolation. I'll read you the bit that I think it is. We began on a sunny hillside where a group of young animals had been penned. Jack and Robbie plunged in among the beasts while Mr. Allen took off his cap and courteously dusted the top of the wall. Your missus can sit here, he said. I paused as I was about to start measuring. My missus. It was the first time anybody had said that to me. I looked over at Helen as she sat cross-legged on the rough stones, her notebook on her knee, pencil at the ready. And as she pushed back the shining dark hair from her forehead, she caught my eye and smiled. And as I smiled back at her, I became aware suddenly of the vast, swelling glory of the dales around us, and of the dale's scent of clover and warm grass, more intoxicating than any wine. And it seemed that my first 2 years at Darrowby had been leading up to this moment, that the first big step of my life was being completed right here, with Helen smiling at me, and the memory fresh in my mind of my new plate hanging in front of Skelldale House. I might have stood there indefinitely in a sort of trance, but Mr. Allen cleared his throat in a marked manner, and I turned back to the job in hand. Right, I said, placing my calipers against the beast's neck. Number 38, 7 millimeters, and circumscribed, I called out to Helen. So, there. That, I think, is the most telling piece of evidence that they have passed this intimacy versus isolation stage. It's James's sudden awareness of that his life has been leading up to this point, that has been leading up to Helen, has been leading up to him being a vet in the Dales, and he's this absolute moment of happiness and fulfillment. That's why they're successful. Yes, they got married, and yes, they are happy together, and I think a good evidence that they were a good match is Helen being totally fine with spending her honeymoon testing cows for tuberculosis. But that sense of fulfillment that they both seem to be experiencing in that moment, that's them passing intimacy versus isolation. The next question on the homework was, describe James's work-life balance. Would this be considered a good balance? What could he have done to improve this balance? Does this have an effect on his career development? what about his family? So I don't think James's work-life balance is good. I certainly relate to his work-life balance. I work far too much and put my work before all else as well. But I don't think it's good or healthy in terms of a long-term situation. So he does not have good work-life balance. What would be considered a good work-life balance is actually taking a honeymoon, actually taking the week off and spending time with his new wife, touring the country like they had originally planned, and saying, Siegfried, I'm really sorry. I understand that you're going to be busy. Maybe you can call in another vet from a neighboring town to help you, but I'm getting married and I need to spend this time with my wife. So that would make a healthier work-life balance. However, making this decision to test cows on his honeymoon did affect his work life, or his work, positively. He was made a partner at his veterinary practice. So he is now a full partner in the practice. He got a promotion in exchange for giving up his honeymoon. So he did, and that's a really common thing. And it's kind of a problem. We are rewarded for prioritizing our work over our home life in many cultures in this day and age, and that can be very problematic over time. So he was rewarded, but we don't necessarily think that's a good thing. And finally, the last bit of it is, what about his family? He got really lucky. I don't know of any other women whose response to, we need to cancel our honeymoon so that I can tuberculin test cows. I don't think any other woman ever would go, okay, I'll come with you and take notes. This sounds like fun. We'll stay in the pub. Like, what? He got lucky. That is like, no, he got lucky. So it doesn't really affect his family yet, but it's quite possible that if this trend were to continue, and he were to continue to prioritize work over his home life to such an extent that Helen could start to feel undervalued and they could have marital problems later on. So I think it's a dangerous path to go down. The final question was, Helen wears pants in the end of the reading. Using Bronfenbrenner's theory and being sure to name which levels you are referring to, what influences affected Helen's decision? Again, using Bronfenbrenner's theory, explain Mrs. Allen's initial reaction to Helen. So let's read from the book. I particularly enjoyed, too, our very first morning when I took Helen to do the test at Allen's. As I got out of the car, I could see Mrs. Allen peeping around the curtains in the kitchen window. She was soon out in the yard, and her eyes popped when I brought my bride over to her. Helen was one of the pioneers of slacks in the Dales, and she was wearing a bright purple pair this morning, which, in modern parlance, would knock your eye out. The farmer's wife was partly shocked, partly fascinating, but she soon found that Helen was of the same stock as herself, and within seconds the two women were chattering busily. I judged from Mrs. Allen's vigorous head nodding and her ever-widening smile that Helen was putting her out of her pain by explaining all of the circumstances. So let's start with Helen and her microsystem. So Helen's microsystem is James at this point. She was living with her parents. Her father, her mother's dead, which you don't know from this reading, but I know because I've read the whole book. But James is pretty much her microsystem at this point, and clearly, and part of her being able to wear pants, this took place in 1937. Part of her ability to wear pants has to do with the fact that her husband is okay with it. So her microsystem is going, oh yeah, no, totally wear pants. And also her day-to-day life, she's sitting cross-legged on a rock. It is possible to do that in a skirt. It is not comfortable to do that in a skirt, especially 1930s skirts, which were very slim and not poofy. It's easier to sit cross-legged on a rock and in a poofy skirt because less worrying about people seeing things. So her microsystem is definitely affecting this decision. Her husband, knowing that her husband is okay with her wearing pants, allows her to feel more comfortable wearing pants, and especially wearing pants to her husband's workplace. So that's important. As for her exosystem, so this is your neighborhood, who's around you, so on and so forth. This is the Yorkshire Dales. The Yorkshire Dales is like as far north in England as you can get before hitting Scotland. It is very conservative. It is very rural. And so actually this would probably kind of convince her, would probably try and steer her away from wearing pants. But it is also a very practical space because they're farmers. So farmers tend to be a little bit more practicable when it comes to fashion, and you wear what you need to wear to get the work done first, and then you put fashion after that. So most likely this would steer her away from wearing pants, except for when it is most practical. I think tuberculin testing cows, wearing pants is probably more practical than wearing a skirt. So there's that. Then we have the macro system. So the macro system is the overall culture, it's mass media, it's that kind of thing. And the macro system is interesting because on the one hand, there's going to be the more conservative side of the macro system, but what's probably influencing Helen here in 1937 is all of the Hollywood beauties who started being pictured, photographed, showing up in magazines and in movies wearing pants. So it's now a fashionable, daring thing for ladies to do. And in young adulthood, in adolescence and young adulthood, a lot of times we want to emulate celebrities. We want to emulate that glamour that we associate with Hollywood and celebrities and that kind of thing. And so Helen wearing pants is most likely a product of these Hollywood stars being photographed wearing pants. So it's the macro system. Then we can move on to Mrs. Allen. So Mrs. Allen has a very different micro system. She's older. We can assume that she's older than Helen because she has 2 grown boys. She's likely grown up in the Yorkshire Dales, just like Helen has, but because of there's this difference in time, she's a little bit older, so she's got a slightly different chronosystem. Her microsystem does not allow for women wearing pants. I'm sure she doesn't own any pants, I bet. Or if she does need to wear pants, she might borrow a pair from her husband for like an afternoon and then go back to her skirts. In her family, in her experience, how she grew up, so her family of origin as well as her family now, girls wear skirts, girls don't wear pants. So her microsystem is influencing her to be shocked when she sees this woman in bright purple pants on her farm. However, she quickly warms up to Helen, and this is because of their shared exosystem. They're both farm women from the Yorkshire Dales. So they have a shared culture, a shared neighborhood, and so both the exosystem and the macro system that they share growing up, these influences, got her over her shock very quickly because she can relate to Helen and she's comfortable with Helen because Helen understands the culture and how to act and so on and so forth, so they can make that connection there. So for Mrs. Allen, it's the microsystem causing her shock, but it's the exosystem, Helen and her shared exosystem and macro system, these cultural values and neighborhoods, that allows her to get over her shock and warm up very quickly to Helen. I hope this has been helpful, and the rest of the slides are done by other people, but please do watch them, learn lots about middle adulthood, and then next week I will be back answering your questions again.